Thanks for tuning in to Crazy Mango Stories. Give a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell for more betrayal stories. The first part unfolds with Brian seated uncomfortably in a grand hall, the room thrumming with the beat of party music and flickering dim lights that seemed to mock his already darkening thoughts. He should have been enjoying himself, but his eyes were fixed on Janet, his wife, across the room. There, beneath the glow of subdued lights, she laughed a little too hard, a little too freely with Ian, the man who had recently slid into their lives like a cat into a birdcage. The scene was almost surreal, a twisted sort of nightmare. Ian leaned closer to Janet, his hand lingering at her elbow, his mouth near her ear, as he whispered something that made her laugh again. This time her head tipped back, and the sparkle in her eyes was unmistakable. Brian's stomach clenched, each laugh from her stabbing deeper into the carefully maintained armor he built over months of suspicion. He was more of a spectator than a participant, as if this spectacle had been orchestrated solely to unravel him, thread by agonizing thread. And then, as if sensing his gaze, Ian locked eyes with Brian and smirked, lifting his glass in a mock salute before leaning in closer to Janet. Brian tried to focus on anything else, the chatter around him, the clinking of glasses, the way the lights flickered in the dimness, but it was impossible. Janet's flirtatious laughter, the way she leaned toward Ian, her lips pulling into a smile that he hadn't seen in years, it was like watching her give away pieces of herself, little bits that he thought were only his to claim. In that moment, he was an outsider to his own life, caught in a nightmare that played out in the open for anyone who bothered to look. He could feel eyes on him, but it wasn't out of sympathy. He knew what people were thinking, the pity masked by their polite smiles as they watched him sit there, forced to witness his wife's brazen flirtation. Some had whispered rumors, he'd heard them. A few bold ones had even joked to his face, testing the waters to see if he knew, if he cared. And now, Ian, self-satisfied, arrogant, and shameless, was delivering blow after blow to Brian's pride with nothing more than a smug grin and the deliberate way he touched Janet, his hand on the small of her back, as if he were the man in her life. Brian's hand tightened around his glass, knuckles white, his jaw set so tightly it ached. The glass felt fragile in his grip, like his self-control was something he could shatter if he wasn't careful. But still, he stayed rooted to the spot, determined not to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing him lose control. It was a war, and his dignity was the last thing he could cling to, even if it was slipping through his fingers faster than he could grasp. At one point, Janet's laugh carried across the room, loud and unmistakable, and a few heads turned toward her. Ian caught Brian's eye again, his lips curling up, and then he leaned close to whisper something in Janet's ear. Whatever he said, it sent a wave of color to her cheeks, and she bit her lip, casting a glance around the room, as if to make sure no one had noticed. Her eyes settled on Brian, and for a split second she looked almost guilty, but then, just as quickly, she looked away, her attention fully on Ian again. The crowd seemed to close in around Brian, their laughter and conversation a suffocating bubble that trapped him in his seat. The voices merged into one chaotic hum, each laugh and whisper a barb digging deeper into him, twisting until the humiliation became almost physical. He could feel his pulse throbbing in his temples, a rhythm that matched the pounding bass in the background, but he forced himself to breathe slowly, clinging to the last fraying threads of his patience. He didn't know how much more he could take. He didn't know if he should. But then, as if sensing his inner struggle, Ian leaned over, his voice carrying just loudly enough over the music. "You look a little lonely there, Brian. You sure you're all right?" The comment was a punch, disguised as a casual remark, and Brian's grip tightened even further. The urge to throw back a retort, to finally unleash the storm that had been building inside him, clawed at him, but he held it back, swallowing hard. He wouldn't give Ian the satisfaction. Not yet. But inside, the fire of his anger flared, hotter than ever, as Ian laughed, a low, mocking sound that reverberated like a countdown to the moment he knew was coming. Brian's restraint was unraveling, each mocking laugh from Ian tearing another thread loose. He could feel the tension in his muscles, a pulsing anger that begged for release, but he held it in check with a control that felt more fragile by the second. Every small humiliation, the way Ian leaned close to Janet, his hand lingering on her back, his smug glances thrown Brian's way as though daring him to react, chipped away at Brian's self-possession. It was a dance of taunts and restrained fury, with Janet a center, seemingly oblivious to the emotional destruction her actions were causing. But then, Ian took it a step further, signaling the bartender for a fresh drink, and with a sly smirk, lifted his glass in Brian's direction. "Here's to the man of the hour," he announced, loud enough to draw a few curious glances. Janet glanced over, frowning slightly, but when Ian nudged her with his elbow, she let out a nervous laugh and clinked her glass against his. It was as if they were united in a private joke, a bond shared between them that excluded Brian entirely. Brian forced himself to breathe, clenching his fists until his nails bit into his palms. He told himself to stay calm, to act as though this display of disrespect didn't bother him, but the lie wasn't convincing anyone. Every person who saw him could read the betrayal on his face, could see his inner turmoil written plainly in his clenched jaw and stiff posture. It felt like they were all in on it, like they'd come to this party to witness the unmaking of Brian's pride. Suddenly, Ian rose from his seat, sliding his arm around Janet's waist and guiding her toward the dance floor. Janet hesitated for just a moment, her gaze flickering back to Brian. But when Ian pulled her closer, she gave in, letting herself be led. The music shifted to a slower tempo, and Brian watched, helpless as his wife moved in rhythm with another man, her body pressed close to his in a way that was undeniably intimate. The world seemed to blur around Brian, his focus narrowing to the two figures entwined on the dance floor. Ian's hands were on Janet's waist, his fingers splayed possessively over her hips, guiding her movements with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. It was a calculated display, a blatant message directed straight at Brian, and the crowd around them seemed to fade into shadows, the music drowning out under the roar of anger in Brian's mind. For a moment, he considered walking away, leaving this scene behind, and reclaiming some shred of dignity, but something held him there, frozen in place. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was the need to confront the truth head-on, to see for himself the betrayal he had only suspected until now. Whatever it was, it kept him rooted to the spot, his gaze locked on Janet and Ian as they moved in sync, oblivious to the storm brewing just a few steps away. Then, as if sensing his gaze, Ian looked up and met Brian's eyes, a knowing smile twisting his lips. He leaned down, whispering something into Janet's ear, and she laughed a soft, delighted sound that cut through Brian like a knife. The last thread of restraint snapped, and Brian found himself on his feet, his movements fueled by a white-hot fury that he could no longer contain. This was it. He couldn't watch another second of this twisted spectacle. The time for silent endurance was over. Brian's legs carried him toward the dance floor before his mind could catch up, the anger in him coursing like an unstoppable wave. The air between them crackled with tension as he closed the distance, his heart pounding in his ears, drowning out the music and the low murmur of voices around them. People parted to let him through, sensing the confrontation that was about to erupt. All eyes were on him, and yet he only saw two people in the room: Janet, who was looking at him with a mixture of surprise and guilt, and Ian, who wore an infuriatingly calm smile, his hand still resting on Janet's waist, as though he owned her. Brian stopped just a foot away from them, close enough to see the satisfaction in Ian's eyes. It was as if this was exactly what Ian wanted, a showdown, a chance to rub salt into Brian's open wound. He could see the smugness in Ian's expression, the way he stood a little taller, almost daring Brian to make a move. That cocky, unbothered posture sent a fresh surge of rage through Brian, a bitter, electric fury that pulled in his clenched fists. "So this is what we're doing now, Janet?" Brian's voice was low, but it sliced through the music like a blade. "Flirting with other men right in front of me." Janet's face flushed, and she looked down, her expression flickering with guilt and defensiveness. "Brian, you're overreacting," she muttered, as if dismissing his rage would somehow deflate it. "We were just dancing." Just dancing?" Brian let out a hollow laugh, his gaze flicking between her and Ian, his eyes narrowing as they settled on the man he now saw as his nemesis. It looked like a lot more than dancing. Ian chuckled softly, almost pityingly, as he lifted his glass. "Come on, Brian," he drawled, his tone laced with mock sympathy. "I don't make a scene. It's just a bit of harmless fun. No need to get your feathers ruffled." The words hit like a punch, the casual cruelty of them stoking Brian's anger to an inferno. He could feel the heat creeping up his neck, his restraint slipping faster than he could hold it. All those months of suspicion, of feeling like a fool, of doubting himself, and yet never quite having the proof, all of it surged to the surface, raw and jagged. Harmless fun. Brian took a step closer, his voice a quiet, dangerous growl. "You think it's harmless to humiliate me in front of everyone? You think it's a game to steal another man's wife?" At that, Janet flinched, her face paling as she looked around, suddenly very aware of the eyes on them. "Brian, please," she whispered, her voice strained. "Not here. Let's talk about this at home." Ian, however, seemed to enjoy every second, his smirk widening as he leaned toward Brian. "If she's so unhappy, maybe that's your problem, Brian," he said, his tone dripping with scorn. "Maybe she just wanted a real man to show her a good time." Those words were the breaking point. In a flash, Brian's hand shot out, grabbing Ian by the collar, yanking him close enough to see the surprise in his eyes. The mocking confidence wavered for a brief moment as Brian held him, his grip strong, his knuckles white with the force of it. "You want to say that again?" Brian's voice was low, but it was lethal, each word a threat. The room was utterly silent now, the crowd around them holding their breath, frozen as they waited for what would happen next. Ian's smirk faltered, but only slightly, his bravado not entirely gone. "Come on, Brian," he said, trying to laugh it off, but there was an edge of nervousness in his tone. "You're making yourself look pathetic." Brian didn't care about looking pathetic. In that moment, his entire world had narrowed down to this confrontation, this one final stand. He was done playing the fool, done holding back for the sake of peace. He had swallowed his pride too many times, and now, with his marriage and his dignity slipping away, he felt nothing but the fierce need to reclaim what was his, even if it meant burning the whole room down in the process. For a long, charged moment, Brian kept his fist clenched in Ian's collar, feeling every tremor of rage ripple through his body. The crowd around them held its collective breath, suspended in the anticipation of the confrontation. Ian's earlier confidence had shrunk to a flicker of nervous amusement, and Janet's expression had twisted into something between horror and shame as she watched her husband grapple with the man who had, up until this moment, been her secret thrill. "Brian," Janet whispered urgently, her voice trembling. She reached out, placing a hand on his arm in an attempt to calm him down. But her touch only fueled his anger. How many times had that same hand touched Ian? How many times had she laughed with him, shared whispers and secret glances behind Brian's back? The questions tore through Brian's mind like shards of glass. He released Ian with a shove, forcing himself to let go before he did something he couldn't take back. "You don't get to make a fool of me, Ian," he said, his voice simmering with barely restrained fury. "Not in front of everyone. Not in front of her." He glanced at Janet, his gaze sharp and unyielding, searching for even a hint of remorse. But all he saw was a guilt-soaked silence as she glanced down, unable to meet his gaze. Ian straightened his shirt collar, trying to regain his composure, though his bravado was shaken. He forced a smirk, determined to maintain his superiority. "Look, Brian, maybe you should calm down," Ian said, his voice tight but mocking. "It's not my fault you couldn't keep her interested." The crowd gasped, a ripple of shock spreading through the onlookers. Janet's face drained of color, and she shot Ian a look of reproach, as if suddenly realizing that he was not the knight in shining armor she'd convinced herself he was. "Is that what this is?" Brian's voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut through the room like a knife. "You think you're giving her something I can't?" Ian shrugged, chuckling lowly as he threw a glance at Janet. "Maybe I am," he said with a shrug. "Maybe she needed a change. I mean, look at you clinging onto her like this. Pathetic." The words hit Brian like a fist to the chest, but instead of weakening him, they solidified his resolve. He'd spent months torturing himself with doubts, pushing down his suspicions for the sake of his marriage. He had allowed himself to live in this limbo, his pride bleeding out slowly with each new suspicion, each subtle confirmation that Janet's affections were no longer his alone. "Maybe it's not her that's been missing something," Brian replied, his voice steady. "Maybe it's you." He turned to Janet, looking her in the eye, forcing her to confront the weight of his betrayal. "Was it worth it, Janet?" he asked, his voice calm but cold. "Was it worth all the lies, all the sneaking around, just for him?" Janet opened her mouth to reply but faltered, the words sticking in her throat. Her eyes glistened, and she looked down, unable to bear the intensity of his gaze. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken regrets, a heavy testament to all the years they'd shared and all the memories that now hung in the balance. Ian, seeing the tide turn, scoffed and reached for his drink. "You're pathetic, Brian," he sneered. "She's outgrown you, and you're too blind to see it." Brian turned to him, a strange calm settling over him, his anger cooling into something more dangerous. "Maybe I am pathetic," he admitted quietly, his gaze unwavering. "But at least I'm not the one trying to steal another man's wife to feel important." Ian's smile faded, his eyes narrowing as the weight of Brian's words settled in. For the first time, he looked genuinely uncertain, his cocky demeanor slipping. Janet shifted uncomfortably beside him, her earlier confidence fading into something more vulnerable, more exposed. Brian turned to the crowd, his voice rising with a newfound clarity. "You all saw it," he said, addressing the witnesses to his humiliation. "I loved her. I trusted her. But it seems that's not enough for some people." He looked at Janet one last time, his expression a mix of heartbreak and resignation. "Enjoy your life, Janet. Enjoy it with him, if that's what you want." With that, he turned and walked away, the weight of his shattered marriage pressing down on him with each step. The room parted for him, silent and somber, as he left behind the woman he had once given his heart to, knowing that she no longer held any power over him. Brian walked out of the party, his mind a storm of emotions, rage, heartbreak, and a strange, numbing clarity settling over him like armor. He could still hear the murmur of the party behind him, feel the eyes that had followed him in silent awe as he left. For months, he'd been carrying the burden of suspicion alone, watching for every telltale sign, each hint that something was wrong. And now, in one unforgettable night, his fears had been confirmed, and there was no taking it back. The cool night air bit at his skin as he stepped outside, but it felt like a relief, a harsh reminder that he was free from the suffocating tension of that room. His heart was pounding, but beneath the frantic beat, there was a curious calm, an eerie stillness that left him feeling both empty and light. He had fought the urge to explode for so long that now, even though the worst had happened, he felt strangely liberated, as if letting go was the only thing he'd needed to do all along. He stopped at the edge of the parking lot, hands clenched into fists as he took in the darkened street, illuminated only by the dim glow of a street lamp. Each flicker of light seemed to echo the flashes of memory, replaying in his mind the smirk on Ian's face, Janet's guilty glances, the way she'd looked away rather than meeting his gaze. The betrayal left a bitter taste in his mouth, one he knew would linger long after this night was over. Brian wanted to scream, to let his rage echo into the night, but something held him back. Instead, he took a deep, shuddering breath, forcing himself to face the pain head-on. What stung most wasn't Ian's arrogance or even Janet's blatant disregard. It was the hollow realization that he'd become a stranger in his own life, a passive observer while someone else took his place. It was humiliating, and yet here, alone in the night, he finally allowed himself to feel the full weight of his heartbreak, to let it settle in his chest like an anchor. As he stared down the empty road, a memory drifted to the surface. He remembered their early years, when he and Janet would go on spontaneous late-night drives, laughing, talking about their dreams, feeling like the world was theirs. It was those memories that cut the deepest now, twisting the knife of betrayal even further. That young couple, so full of life and hope they felt like strangers to him now, ghosts of a life that no longer existed. He could go back inside, confront Janet again, shout his pain for all to hear, demand answers he knew she would never give honestly. But what would it change? She had made her choice, and he could see clearly now that she'd chosen long before tonight, long before he'd found the courage to confront her. She had been slipping away for months, and he had clung to a version of her that didn't exist anymore. The realization was freeing and devastating all at once. Turning back toward his car, he knew that tonight was the beginning of an uncertain path, one where he would have to redefine his life without her. And maybe that was okay. Maybe this ending was exactly what he needed to find himself again. Brian took one last look at the building, where the faint sound of music and laughter spilled out into the night, a reminder of the world he was leaving behind. With a resolute step, he walked toward his car, feeling the ache in his heart shift from a raw wound to a scar that he could, someday, live with. He would rebuild piece by piece. As Brian drove through the deserted streets, a hollow silence filled the car, broken only by the low hum of the engine. The weight of the night pressed down on him, sinking in with a finality that left him feeling both numb and exposed. Each streetlight cast fleeting shadows across the windshield, reflecting the fractured state of his thoughts as he replayed the events of the night over and over. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles white against the leather. What did it mean now to go home? The word itself felt foreign, robbed of the warmth and comfort it used to hold. He could picture the empty rooms waiting for him, the stark quiet that would replace Janet's presence. But was her presence ever truly there anymore? How long had she been a ghost in their home, slipping through the motions of their life while her heart resided somewhere else entirely? The questions felt endless, but he forced himself to stay with each one, to let them unravel in his mind rather than push them away. He was tired of ignoring the truth. Tonight had shown him just how much he'd sacrificed for the illusion of stability, for a marriage he'd been fighting to keep alive alone. In the rearview mirror, he glimpsed himself a man who had poured everything into his relationship, who had believed too strongly in love to see its slow erosion right under his nose. Brian's phone buzzed on the seat beside him, breaking the silence. He glanced at it, the screen illuminating Janet's name. Her messages had started minutes after he left, a string of short texts he hadn't read. "Brian, please, I didn't mean for this to happen. Come back, let's talk." He stared at the notifications, feeling a mix of disgust and pity. She wanted to talk now, after everything was laid bare. Now that her affair had been forced into the open, she was scrambling to pick up the pieces of their broken relationship, as though words alone could mend what she had torn apart. He let out a bitter laugh, the sound echoing in the empty car. All those months she'd kept him in the dark, and now, in the aftermath, she thought she could just explain her way out of it. With a deep breath, he ignored the messages, pressing his phone face down on the passenger seat. He didn't need to hear excuses or her half-hearted apologies. In the end, words were just words, and hers had lost all meaning the moment she'd betrayed him. Brian turned onto a familiar road, his grip loosening slightly as he neared a place he hadn't been in months, the quiet lake where he and Janet used to spend time during the early days of their marriage. It had been their haven, a spot where they'd shared countless late-night talks, dreams, and promises. But tonight he was here alone, needing its silence to help him process the unthinkable. He parked by the edge, stepping out into the cool night air, the scent of water and pine carrying with it a strange sense of comfort. He walked down the small path to the shore, his footsteps crunching over the gravel. The lake was still, mirroring the star-speckled sky, a stark contrast to the chaos he felt inside. Brian crouched by the water's edge, watching the gentle ripples that spread out from where he tossed a small pebble into the lake. It reminded him of his marriage, the way a single choice, a single betrayal, had sent waves through his life, disrupting everything he'd thought was steady. The silence here was different from the silence at home. It didn't feel hollow, but whole, grounding. It gave him the space to breathe, to mourn what he'd lost, and to begin letting go. As he sat by the lake, the memories came rushing back, moments when he and Janet had shared their dreams, when they'd laughed and loved without hesitation. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to grieve for those memories, to acknowledge that there had been beauty in their time together. But he also knew that those memories were just that remnants of a past that couldn't be reclaimed. The woman who had shared them with him was gone, or perhaps she'd never been real at all. He stayed there until the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, painting the lake with soft hues of orange and pink. A new day was coming, inevitable and unrelenting, reminding him that life would go on with or without the pain that now lay within him. For the first time that night, a small sense of peace settled over him. He couldn't change what had happened, couldn't make Janet's betrayal go away. But he could choose to move forward, to step into the unknown without the weight of her lies holding him down. As he rose to his feet, Brian felt a shift within himself, a quiet resolve, a sense of purpose that had been missing for far too long. He didn't have all the answers, and he knew that the journey ahead would be difficult. But for the first time, he was ready to face it alone.